275 lives, a 100-ton error nobody caught, and a runway that was about to run out. This is the story of Emirates Flight 407. On the night of 20 March 2009, Melbourne Airport was quiet under a clear sky and a cold wind. Emirates Flight 407 sat ready for a 14-hour flight to Dubai, a journey of nearly 7,000 kilometers. On board the 4-engine Airbus A340 were 257 passengers and 18 crew, including 4 pilots, instead of the usual 2, since Emirates required a relief crew for flights this long. The captain and first officer were both highly experienced, with over 8,000 hours of flying each, much of it on the A340 and the very similar A330. That experience should have made the night routine. Instead, it was about to help cause one of the most dangerous takeoff accidents in aviation history. The cockpit was crowded. The 2 pilots, 2 ground engineers finishing last checks, and the relief captain, 5 people in a space built for far fewer. The relief first officer waited outside in the galley until the engineers finished. Everyone was talking and working. It felt completely normal. It was actually the first crack in a chain of mistakes that would nearly end this flight before it left the ground. It began when the first officer entered the aircraft's weight into the electronic flight bag, or EFB, the tablet pilots use to calculate takeoff thrust, flap setting, and speed. Instead of the aircraft's real weight of about 362 tons, he typed in 262 tons, 100 tons too light. Every number the EFB calculated afterwards and passed on to the aircraft's flight management computer was wrong. Less thrust, less flap, and a takeoff speed far slower than a 362-ton aircraft actually needed. Picture riding a bicycle built for one, except 2 extra passengers have quietly climbed on. If you still pedal as if you were riding alone, the bike barely moves and becomes far more likely to tip over. That is exactly what was about to happen to an aircraft carrying 100 tons it wasn't accounted for. The captain picked up the EFB to double-check the numbers, the last real chance to catch the mistake. Partway through, someone else in the cockpit said something that pulled his attention away, and he never finished the check. The wrong numbers went straight into the aircraft's computer, unquestioned. Flight 407 pushed back from the gate 7 minutes early. Nobody yet knew the numbers now guiding its takeoff were badly wrong. The aircraft taxied to runway 16. Flaps were set to position 1, less lift than the second or third setting normally used for a heavy takeoff. The engines spooled up to a power setting calculated for an aircraft 100 tons lighter than reality. The A340 already feels heavy and slow leaving the ground, so nothing about this felt unusual to the pilots. 100 knots, the captain called out. The aircraft had now passed the point where stopping was safe. Seconds later, it crossed V1, the speed of no return, then reached rotation speed, the moment the nose should lift and the aircraft should fly. The first officer pulled back on the side stick. Nothing happened. He pulled harder, still nothing. Only a kilometer of runway remained, and the aircraft was still glued to the ground. "Pull, pull!" the captain shouted. The first officer hauled the stick back as far as it would go, and the nose finally began to rise. For 2 seconds, there was relief. Then came the sight every pilot dreads. The nose was up, but the aircraft's altitude was still reading almost 0. The body of the plane hadn't left the ground at all. Then, the tail struck the runway. At nearly 300 kilometers an hour, metal scraped against concrete, sparks flew, and the smell of burning metal reached the cabin as red emergency lights lit up inside. The impact was hard enough to tear the flight data recorder from its mount. The runway was almost gone, and beyond its end was a steep drop. With no room left to stop, the captain shoved the throttles to full power in one final attempt to get airborne. At the very last stretch of runway, the main wheels finally lifted, then the tail. The huge aircraft climbed away, wobbling, barely flying, clipping a runway light and a localizer antenna on the way up. A warning flashed on the cockpit screen, tail strike. Air traffic control confirmed it. They had seen the sparks. Dubai was no longer possible. Flight 407 had to return to Melbourne. But there was a new problem. The aircraft still carried more than 130 tons of fuel, far too heavy to land safely. The only option was to dump fuel over the sea before attempting to land. As air traffic control guided them out to altitude, the first officer reopened the EFB to recalculate the landing weight and froze. The screen still showed the aircraft as 100 tons lighter than it actually was. Only now did the crew realize the size of the mistake that had nearly cost 275 lives. There was no time to dwell on it. From the back, the relief first officer reported that the cabin wasn't pressurizing. The tail strike had cracked the fuselage and air was leaking out, meaning they couldn't safely climb any higher. The captain radioed, "Pan, pan, 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 pan." Not a full emergency, but a clear signal that they needed priority and no delays. Melbourne cleared all other traffic and readied emergency crews on the ground. Now came a decision with no easy answer. How much fuel to dump? The safe landing weight was 243 tons. Landing heavier risked overheating the brakes, a landing gear failure, or worse, damage to the already torn tail. But dumping too much fuel meant having nothing left if they needed to go around and try again. They settled on dumping 80 tons, leaving the aircraft at 280 tons, still 37 tons over the limit, but with enough fuel in reserve for 2 or 3 landing attempts if needed. This time, they checked the numbers 3 times, twice on tablets, once by hand in the paper performance book. So why had a 100-ton error gone unnoticed in the first place? That night, the cockpit had broken the sterile cockpit rule, which limits conversation during critical phases of flight to essential work-related talk only. Instead, the gate had been crowded and noisy. Engineers, announcements, side conversations. In that noise, the mistake slipped through. The relief pilots, who should have cross-checked the numbers independently, couldn't. There wasn't even room to open a second tablet. And because the false numbers were only slightly different from what the crew was used to flying on the lighter A330, nothing about them looked obviously wrong. As fuel dumping finished and the aircraft began its descent, a strange rumbling came from the rear, then a panicked call. Smoke was coming from the back of the cabin. The first officer told the tower, "We are returning immediately." Runway 16 had better wind, but it was further away. With every second now critical, they lined up instead for the closer runway 34, the very runway whose lights they had broken during takeoff, only this time from the opposite direction, and with a tailwind that would push their landing speed even higher. The captain addressed the passengers directly, explaining the tail strike and the fuel dump calmly. Many had already heard the scraping and seen sparks outside their windows and were frightened. The first officer warned the cabin crew to prepare for a possible evacuation after landing. At 11:30 p.m., Flight 407 touched down hard on runway 34. The captain hit the brakes and reverse thrust with everything he had. But for a few terrifying seconds, the aircraft seemed to be speeding up, not slowing down. "The speed is too high," the first officer kept repeating. Finally, right at the very end of the runway, the aircraft rolled to a stop. No fire, no injury. All 257 passengers and 18 crew were safe minutes after coming closer to catastrophe than almost anyone on board would ever know. That night, Emirates told the crew not to contact their families, warning that their phones would be monitored. Days later, back in Dubai, the pilots were dismissed. But the incident also forced real change. Airlines introduced systems to automatically flag incorrect takeoff weight data, and many now require 2 pilots to calculate takeoff figures independent. So, a mistake like this one can never again slip through unnoticed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story,